The greatest loss in that dynamic was never going to be yours. It was always going to be theirs. Because a narcissist's biggest mistake is losing you. Not in the way they might understand loss, not in terms of control or convenience, but in a deeper, more meaningful sense. The kind of loss that comes from letting go of someone who is capable of real connection, real empathy, real depth. For a long time, you may not have seen yourself that way. When you're inside a narcissistic dynamic, your strengths are often reframed as weaknesses. Your empathy becomes a too sensitive. Your willingness to communicate becomes a too much. Your desire for clarity becomes a dramatic or a demanding. And over time, those messages can start to sink in. You begin to question yourself. You wonder if maybe you are asking for too much. If maybe your expectations are unrealistic. If maybe the problem isn't the dynamic, but you. But here's what starts to become clear when you step back, when you gain distance, when you begin to see the pattern instead of just the moments. You were never the problem. You were the person trying to bring something real into a space that was built on imbalance. You were the one offering consistency in a system that thrived on unpredictability. You were the one showing up with honesty in a dynamic that relied on distortion. And that matters. Even if it wasn't recognized in the moment, even if it wasn't valued the way it should have been. Because what you brought into that relationship was not something small. It was not something replaceable. It was not something they will easily find again. You brought presence. You brought patience. You brought patience. You brought a willingness to understand, to connect, to grow. And while those qualities may have been taken for granted or even exploited, they do not lose their value simply because they were not appreciated. In fact, their value becomes even clearer once you begin to reclaim them. Because when you start to pull back, when you stop over-giving, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop trying to fix something that was never balanced to begin with, you begin to see the dynamic differently. You begin to realize how much of the relationship depended on your effort. Your emotional labor, your ability to hold space even when your own needs were not being met. And that realization can be both empowering and painful. Empowering because it shows you how much strength you had. Painful because it reveals how much of that strength was poured into something that could not fully receive it. But within that pain, there is clarity. And that clarity changes the narrative. You stop seeing yourself as the one who lost something valuable. And you begin to see that what was lost was someone who was willing to love deeply, to show up fully, to invest in something real. That loss is not yours to carry. That loss belongs to the person who could not recognize it, who could not meet it, who could not sustain it. And here's where it becomes even more complex, because narcissists often don't experience loss in the same way. They may not sit with it, reflect on it, or process it with emotional depth. Instead, they may move quickly to replace the dynamic, to find another source of validation, another person to step into a similar role. And from the outside, that can be incredibly confusing. It can make you question everything again. Did I matter at all? Oh, is any of it real? Oh, why does it seem so easy for them to move on? But what you are witnessing is not healing. It is avoidance. It is the continuation of a pattern that prioritizes external validation over internal reflection. Because to truly understand the loss of someone like you would require something that narcissistic patterns tend to resist. Accountability and self-awareness, the willingness to sit with discomfort and ask difficult questions. And without that, the cycle continues. But you are no longer in that cycle, and that is where the shift becomes profound. Because while they may continue repeating patterns, you are breaking them. You are stepping out of a dynamic that required you to constantly prove your worth. You are stepping into a space where your value is not something to be negotiated. And as you do that, your perspective begins to change. You begin to see your empathy not as a flaw, but as a strength that simply needs boundaries. You begin to see your desire for connection not as a too much, but as a reflection of your capacity for depth. You begin to understand that what you were asking for, respect, consistency, honesty, was not unreasonable. It was healthy. And that understanding becomes a turning point. Because once you truly see that, it becomes very difficult to settle for less. You no longer feel the same pull toward dynamics that require you to shrink. You no longer feel the need to chase validation from someone who withholds it. You no longer feel responsible for managing someone else's inability to show up fully. And that is where your power returns, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet, steady shift in how you see yourself, how you value yourself, how you choose to show up in your own life. And as that shift continues, you may begin to notice something else, a sense of space. Space where there used to be constant emotional noise. Space where you can finally hear your own thoughts, your own needs, your own voice. And in that space, you begin to reconnect with parts of yourself that may have been overshadowed. Your interests, your sense of peace, your ability to experience joy without it being tied to someone else's mood or approval. And that reconnection is not just healing, it is transformative. Because it allows you to rebuild your sense of self from a place of truth rather than reaction. You are no longer defining yourself by how well you can maintain a relationship. You are defining yourself by how authentically you can live. And that authenticity becomes your foundation. It guides your choices, it shapes your boundaries, it reinforces your sense of worth, even when external circumstances are uncertain. And as you continue to build that foundation, something becomes increasingly clear. You were never meant to stay in a space where your value had to be constantly proven. You were never meant to be the one holding everything together while losing yourself in the process. You were never meant to accept a version of connection that left you feeling confused, diminished, or unseen. And the fact that you are no longer there, that you are stepping away, that you are choosing differently, is not a failure. It is a breakthrough. Because it means you have recognized something that many people struggle to see. That love, in its healthiest form, does not require you to abandon yourself up. That connection, when it is real, does not leave you questioning your worth. That relationships, when they are balanced, do not rely on one person doing all the emotional work. And once you internalize that, your standards change, not in a rigid or defensive way, but in a way that reflects your growth. You begin to expect mutual effort, mutual respect, mutual accountability. And you are no longer willing to compromise those things for the sake of keeping a connection alive. Because you understand now that a connection that requires you to diminish yourself is not something worth preserving. And that understanding is what makes the loss of you so significant. Because you are no longer available in the way you once were. You are no longer pouring your energy into a dynamic that cannot sustain it. You are no longer reinforcing patterns that keep someone else comfortable at your expense. And that absence, that shift, creates a kind of loss that cannot be easily replaced, not because you were perfect, not because you were without flaws, but because you were real. And real is something that cannot be replicated through performance or control. It requires presence. It requires vulnerability. It requires a willingness to engage in something that is mutual and honest. And when that is lost, it leaves a space that is difficult to fill with anything superficial. But again, that is not something you need to concern yourself with, because your focus now is not on what they lost. It is on what you are gaining: clarity, freedom, a deeper connection to yourself. And as you continue to move forward, that focus becomes more and more natural. You are no longer looking back in the same way. You are no longer measuring your worth by how the relationship ended. You are no longer seeking closure from someone who could not fully understand what they had. Instead, you are creating your own closure through understanding, through growth, through the choices you make every day to honor your own needs and your own truth. And those choices begin to shape a new reality. One where you are not defined by what you endured, but by how you evolved. One where your relationships are not based on imbalance, but on mutual respect. One where your sense of self is not dependent on external validation, but rooted in internal clarity. And as that reality takes shape, you may begin to feel something that was difficult to access before. A sense of peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. You are no longer trying to make sense of something that never made sense. You are no longer sacrificing your well-being to maintain a connection that was never balanced. And in that peace, you begin to see yourself more clearly, not as the person who was a too much, not as the person who failed to make it work, but as the person who had the courage to walk away from something that was not aligned with who they truly are. And that courage, that awareness, that growth, that is what makes losing you their biggest mistake. even if they never fully understand it, even if they never acknowledge it, even if they continue moving through life without reflecting on what was lost. Because the truth does not require the recognition to exist, it stands on its own, and you stand in it now, more aware, more grounded, more connected to your own worth than you have ever been before. And that changes everything, not just in how you see the past, but in how you move forward. Because you are no longer carrying the weight of trying to be enough for someone who could not receive it. You are stepping into a space where you already are enough. And from that space, your life begins to expand in ways that are not limited by someone else's inability to meet you where you stand. And as that expansion continues, you begin to experience something that once felt distant, a sense of alignment between who you are and how you live, a sense of clarity that guides your decisions, a sense of self that is no longer shaped by someone else's perception. And that alignment becomes your strength. It becomes the reason you no longer settle, the reason you no longer chase, the reason you no longer question your worth in the face of someone else's inconsistency, because you've already answered that question for yourself. And the answer is no longer dependent on them.